Okay, so the last relativist approach to ethics we're going to explore is cultural relativism, um, or sometimes called conventionalism. And what I'm going to do is just roll through a series of statements that proponents of cultural relativism often offer in support of it as reasons to embrace it. And as I do this, see if you can spot how cultural relativism is both similar to and different from ethical subjectivism. Okay, so the first statement. Different societies have different moral codes. There's no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. Okay, this is in perfect keeping with relativism in general, right? Because the relativist believes that it's impossible for us to have knowledge of any aspect of objective reality, that all we really can have knowledge of are our internal experiences, our impressions, our sensations, our beliefs about our experiences. Because there's no objective standard, the moral status of our own society and every other society has no special status because there's no way to compare them. Because there's no universal truths in ethics. And then sort of the conclusion that the cultural relativist would come to then is something along these lines, right? That when we talk about what's moral and what isn't, what we really mean is this: the moral code of a society determines what is moral and not within that society. Okay? So when we look at any given society, any given culture, that culture is going to have norms and expectations that are unique to it. Or maybe not unique to it. Maybe they're shared by other cultures and societies. But whatever those norms and expectations for behavior are within that culture, within that society for its members, that becomes by default what's moral, right? So just like in subjectivism, we begin with a lot of the same kind of assumptions that everybody has different ideas about morality. Therefore, each individual person gets to determine for themselves what's moral and what isn't, and their individual belief in their moral claims is what makes their moral claims true. Now, cultural relativism is a little different because it's saying here that, look, you can be within a culture and you can have your own ideas about what's morally permissible and isn't, but if it doesn't line up with what your cultural norms and expectations are, you are by definition wrong. Okay? Because it's the culture and what it's concluded are the appropriate norms and expectations for behavior that gets to establish what's morally permissible and what's impermissible. All right, so you can imagine folks are going to have some problems with some of these statements. There's going to be lots of people who come forward and accept that first statement. Of course, it's true that different societies have different moral codes. That doesn't necessarily imply, they'll say, that there's no objective standard that can be used. They'll point to what they believe are objective standards that can be used, that they think are universal truths in ethics, and that therefore would undermine this statement here, that the moral code of a society determines what's right and wrong within that society. They're gonna say, look, I have these objective standards that I can appeal to that will allow me to show you that it's not the case that all cultural expectations and norms are equally morally good. Okay, I don't, they would say, for example, I don't think that in cultures where they throw acid in the face of little girls trying to go to school, I don't think that that moral code is viable and good just because the majority in power in that group decided to embrace that kind of behavior as morally permissible. Now, an interesting thing about cultural relativism and this claim that each society is empowered to define for itself what's moral and what isn't, is that you'll oftentimes hear people who are promoting cultural relativism make a claim that kind of undermines their entire position here. And it's something you saw with ethical relativism. So you'll hear cultural relativists oftentimes say things like, we should reject arrogance and adopt an attitude of tolerance toward the practices of other cultures. In other words, cultural relativists will oftentimes be big proponents of cultural diversity. But that itself seems like a moral claim. Right? So if it's true that in any given society, the majority gets to determine what's moral and what isn't, then it seems like a society could come to this conclusion that we should reject arrogance and adopt an attitude of tolerance towards the practices of other cultures. But it also seems to be the case that you could come to the exact opposite conclusion and still be consistent with cultural relativism. And so in other words, you could adopt in a given society, you could say things like, no, we're not going to reject arrogance. We're going to be arrogance. We get to define what is moral and immoral, particularly us in power, and we're not going to tolerate the practices of other cultures. In fact, we're going to squash other cultures, or maybe even eliminate the members of other cultures. And by the definition of cultural relativism, we would be doing something moral, because it's what our group determined what to do, to oppress some number of members of a particular culture. All right, so it's just an interesting contradiction for both of these. There's another way to frame the cultural relativism argument that's a little bit sort of more straightforward, and it goes like this. The first premise would be people's judgment about right and wrong differ from culture to culture. If people's judgments about right and wrong differ from culture to culture, then right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. Therefore, right and wrong are relative to culture, and there are no objective moral principles. Well, so one argument here that we might make is, yes, you're clearly right about this first premise here. People's judgment about right and wrong do differ from culture to culture. Nobody's going to disagree with that. But is it the case that if people disagree about things, that's an indication that there's no right answer? I mean, what if I made the statement to you, if people disagree about what the answer to a math problem is, then there's no right answer to the problem? It's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Why would that, if that's not the case for math, why would it be the case for ethics? Okay, what if there was some objective standard that we could use for determining right and wrong? Then wouldn't this premise here be false? And if this premise here is false, this conclusion doesn't follow. You can see down here this little cartoon of somebody who's obviously talking to a judge, a lawyer in defense of a client. He's saying, "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty by reason of cultural relativism." And while that may sound funny, I'll show you in a video how that actually has been used as a defense. All right, so some problems with cultural relativism you may have spotted. Can groups be morally wrong? Was the South in the United States, were they just different when they embraced slavery, or were they wrong? Right? The majority of people, let's say, in Southern culture at that time, believed that slavery was morally permissible. To them, it was. Did that make it? Does that make it so? Were they just different in the ways they thought about the lives of human beings and their value? Do you belong to just one culture, or do you belong to multiple cultures? What cultures do you belong to? You're part of CR culture, to the extent that we have one anymore. I remember, growing up and surfing, surf culture was very specific and very unique. But surf culture wasn't the only culture that I belonged to. I belong to lots of different cultures. We all do. And so then the question comes up, well, what do we do if we're facing some sort of a dilemma or conflict and it involves my membership in multiple cultures? How do we resolve that? There's no objective standard that I can appeal to decide that one culture matters more than the other, or that one culture is more reliable than the other. But I can certainly think of lots of instances where what would be considered morally permissible within one culture would not be considered morally permissible in another culture. So, for example, you're a part of the culture that drives cars. And there's certain kinds of behaviors that are morally permissible in our culture in response to people cutting us off on the road. And I'm going to tell you, those things that are morally permissible and impermissible in our culture when you get cut off on the road are not the same things that are morally permissible and impermissible than when you get cut off on a wave surfing. Right? There's a different set of rules there. So how do we navigate these kinds of conflicts between the different cultures that we may have our feet in? All right, so you can see here, going back to our friend, I got to come up with a name for this, sort of the moral framework. People make moral claims. They got to offer reasons in support of those moral claims. And with cultural relativism, it's pretty easy. You say, look, what you're doing over there is the right or the wrong thing. And they say, why? Because that's what the group has determined. Okay, it's going to be that easy for a cultural relativist to make their argument. They're just going to point to whatever the norm or expectation is within that group and say, there's my reference point. That's what makes my claim true. Okay, and you can see then that sort of at the foundation of this any moral argument in cultural relativism will be that the norms and expectations of any given culture, those are the things that have power. Those are the things that matter. That's the foundation for our ethical arguments.